The wax of the chapel candles still smelled of honey when Eleanor Hale first heard the rule that would govern her marriage. Rain tapped against the vicarage window, her glove lay damp on the table beside an open music book, and the Duke of Wexford's man of business, with his dry voice and careful cuffs, said there was one personal condition his Grace insisted upon above all others. She must never touch a pianoforte under the Duke's roof. At first, Eleanor thought she had misheard him. Her father, who had been staring at the account papers as if they might save him from shame, looked up in confusion. Her younger sisters went still by the hearth. The little room held the scent of coal smoke, wet wool, and old hymnals, and into that ordinary poverty came something so cold, so strangely exact, that it seemed less like a marriage article than a sentence. The gentleman explained it with polished restraint. Since the death of the late Duchess of Wexford in childbed, the house had remained without music. His Grace wished it understood from the beginning that the custom would continue. Needlework, reading, household management, charitable duties, all these would be welcomed. Music would not. Eleanor's fingers were resting on the edge of the table. They tightened once, then stilled. She had been practical all her life. A vicar's daughter learned quickly what could and could not be afforded, and romance had never sat at her elbow when she reckoned the grocer's bill or turned worn cuffs for a younger sister. She knew why the offer had come. Wexford needed a wife of good name and modest demands. Her family needed rescue from debts that had grown too old to hide under politeness. Yet this command found the very center of her. In her father's parish, she had played for baptisms, Christmas vigils, harvest suppers, funerals, and lonely old women who only smiled when the keys were singing. The Duke, who had never met her, had somehow chosen the one thing that was most alive in her hands, and forbidden it. She agreed anyway. There are moments, aren't there, when a woman hears the door shut and steps through it all the same, because there are others standing behind her. Eleanor signed her name in a hand that did not tremble. The next morning she traveled to Wexford Abbey through lanes silvered with mist, and by dusk she stood beside a man whose face was as severe as weathered stone. He was handsome in the hard, unwelcoming way of a carved monument. When he addressed her after the brief ceremony, his voice was low, controlled, almost weary. "I trust my condition was made plain, madam." "It was, Your Grace." He gave one small nod, no welcome, no apology, only that. The abbey itself seemed to breathe in whispers. The servants walked softly over the black and cream tiles of the entrance hall. A fire burned in the great drawing room, yet even the logs seemed to settle without a crack. Somewhere beneath the beeswax polish, the lavender linen, and the faint mineral chill of old stone, there was another scent too. Closed air, as though one corridor had not been properly opened in many months. Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper, took Eleanor upstairs with a face composed into duty. At the turn of the landing, Eleanor noticed a passage screened off by heavy velvet drapes. She might have walked past it. Then, from beyond that dim stretch of hall, there came a single piano note, soft, trembling, unmistakable, and every servant within earshot froze. If you'd like to stay with this story, subscribe and come a little farther into Wexford with me. No one breathed for the space of a heartbeat. Then Mrs. Finch moved first. She did not gasp or cross herself or call for a footman. She simply turned, quick as a woman used to preventing scenes, and drew the velvet drape fully across the mouth of the passage. The fabric whispered over the floor. One maid dropped her eyes at once. Another flushed scarlet. Somewhere farther off, a coal settled in a grate with a dull tick, and the sound seemed indecently loud. "Her Grace's rooms are prepared," the housekeeper said, as if nothing had happened. Eleanor followed her upstairs because there was nothing else to do. The abbey's grand staircase curved beneath portraits darkened by age and varnish. Candles stood in silver branches along the walls, each flame steady, each glass chimney polished clear. The air smelled of beeswax, old stone, and the faint starch of fresh linen. Her chamber was large enough to hold the whole vicarage parlor twice over. A fire glowed in a white marble hearth. Hot bricks had been slipped beneath the bedclothes. On the dressing table stood a china ewer painted with blue cornflowers beside a brush set that had belonged, Mrs. Finch said carefully, to no one of consequence. It was a kindness, that last part. Eleanor heard it for what it was. She removed her gloves finger by finger and laid them beside the ewer. "What lies behind that curtain?" Mrs. Finch's face became very still. "The east corridor, Your Grace." "And the note?" The older woman lowered her hands into the folds of her apron. "I would not know." It was too practiced to be true, and they both knew it. Yet Wexford Abbey was plainly a house where truths were not always denied. Very often they were dusted, folded, and put out of sight. Eleanor did not press further. She asked instead when dinner would be served, whether the village accounts were kept in the steward's room, whether the still room reported to the housekeeper or directly to the kitchens. Mrs. Finch answered with visible relief. Practical questions were safe country. Dinner was announced at 8. The Duke of Wexford was already in the dining room when she entered, standing with his hand on the mantel, his black coat throwing his height into harsher relief. Firelight touched the edge of his cheekbone and left the rest of his face in shadow. He bowed. She curtsied. They took their places at a long table gleaming with crystal and silver, though only 2 settings had been laid. The soup smelled of thyme and cream. The bread was still warm. He did not eat at once. "Someone was careless," he said. Eleanor looked up. "Your Grace?" "In the hall." His gray eyes met hers, direct now, cool enough to sting. "You heard something that should not have been heard." She set down her spoon. "Then your household keeps strange company with accidents." For one fleeting instant, something changed in his expression. Not anger exactly, but attention. Before he could answer, the butler opened the door and announced, "Lady Agnes Vale." Lady Agnes Vale entered as though the room had been waiting for her permission to continue. She was not young, though she dressed with the care of a woman who had long understood the uses of effect. Her mourning silk was flawless. The jet at her throat caught the candlelight in black sparks. She was handsome in a narrow, disciplined way, and there was something in her face that echoed beauty once seen elsewhere and remembered with pain. Eleanor knew at once, without needing to be told, that this was Clara's sister. The likeness must have been softened in the dead woman, made warmer by life. In Agnes, it had hardened into management. "My dear Wexford," she said, offering her cheek with practiced tenderness. "You dine too formally. It makes grief look theatrical." The Duke did not rise to the bait. "Lady Agnes, you were not expected until tomorrow." "Family seldom keeps to a timetable." Then she turned to Eleanor. Her eyes moved over the new duchess's plain silk, the unadorned wrists, the face still touched by country air and rain. She smiled, and somehow the smile managed to praise and diminish at once. "So this is the bride. How very suitable." Eleanor answered with the courtesy owed to rank and relation. Agnes took her place at table as if she had always done so, and perhaps she had. The servants adjusted with the smoothness of long practice. A fresh glass appeared. Another dish was brought. Yet the room had changed. Before, the air had been cold. Now it was taut. Agnes spoke first of the road, then of a bishop's indisposition, then of linen ordered for the estate chapel. At the word chapel, the Duke's hand paused beside his wine. Eleanor noticed it. Agnes noticed her noticing. That was the sort of woman she was. "The year's mind memorial must be exact," Agnes said, taking broth she did not seem to taste. "My sister deserved at least that. The white hangings were badly stored last season. I had them aired myself, and the organ in the chapel has been neglected. I will not have a sour note on that day." The irony of it sat between them like a third candle flame. Wexford said quietly, "It will be seen to." "I am relieved." Agnes folded her napkin with elegant fingers. "Memory requires discipline. Houses decay when sentiment is allowed to grow untidy." Her gaze drifted to Eleanor's hands resting near her plate. It was a small thing, that glance. A lesser woman might have missed it. Eleanor did not. She understood then that the rule she had married under did not belong to the Duke alone. It was guarded, kept, fed. After dinner, when custom required that she withdraw, Agnes rose too. In the drawing-room, she walked past the covered instrument by the window without looking at it. Her perfume smelled faintly of violets and starch. She sat near the fire and said, in the same mild voice one might use to discuss weather, "You have been told, I trust, never to touch anything with keys in this house." Eleanor met her eyes. "I have." Agnes inclined her head. "Good. Some women confuse talent with entitlement. My sister never did." From the hall came the sudden scrape of a chair, a muffled exclamation, and then one clear note struck again. The sound was followed at once by a crash of silver somewhere beyond the drawing-room door. Agnes rose with a sharp intake of breath. Wexford was already moving. Eleanor stood too, not out of boldness, but because every nerve in her body had gone alert. In the hall, the candles threw long bars of light across the tiles, and at the foot of a small side table a young footman had gone white to the lips. A salver rocked beside his shoes. One spoon still spun in a circle, ringing faintly. Near his elbow, half hidden by the velvet curtain that screened the east passage, sat a narrow walnut stool with a closed keyboard built into it, like a traveling instrument. One key had sunk crookedly under the lad's accidental weight. No one looked first at the boy. They looked at the key. "Thomas," Mrs. Finch said under her breath, as if speaking too loudly might shatter something already cracked. The footman tried to kneel and nearly slipped. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I was moving the side table for Lady Agnes. I did not see." "Take it away," Agnes said. Her voice was not raised. It was enough. The command struck harder for being so neat. Thomas flinched as though slapped. Wexford's face had altered in a manner Eleanor had not yet seen. He was not merely displeased. He looked briefly ill, the way a man might look if cold water had been poured straight into his chest. Still, when he spoke, his tone was level. "Stand up. You have cut your hand." Only then did Eleanor see the bright bead of blood on the boy's thumb where the silver had bitten him. A ridiculous little wound, and yet it brought the room back to earth. Mrs. Finch signaled a maid for linen. Agnes had already taken a step toward the curtained corridor. "That should not be left in the hall," she said. "It belongs with the rest." The rest. The phrase hung there. Eleanor knew without being told that she meant the late Duchess's things, the covered pieces no one used and no one dared discard. Wexford bent and righted the little instrument himself. His hand rested on the walnut lid for only a moment, but in that moment every servant looked away. "It stays where it is tonight," he said. Agnes turned. "Why?" "Because I said so." It was the first sharp edge Eleanor had heard in his voice, and it changed the air more surely than the struck note had done. Agnes's nostrils thinned, but she smiled for the servants, for the house, for anyone watching closely enough to matter. "As you wish." Thomas was led off to have his hand bound. Mrs. Finch dismissed the others. The hall emptied by degrees, with that peculiar haste people use when they are pretending not to flee. Eleanor thought the scene was over. Then Wexford straightened, looked once at the curtain, and said without turning toward her, My wife should retire. The east corridor is not for you. And from behind the velvet, very soft, almost like breath against wire, came the tiny ticking sound of a metronome, already in motion. Eleanor did retire, but she did not sleep. The Abbey had its own night language, fire settling in the grate, wind brushing the leaded panes. Somewhere far below, a door eased shut with care. And underneath it all, remembered more than heard, that faint, measured ticking behind the curtain. She lay with her eyes open to the dark canopy above her bed and understood something before morning came. This was not only a grieving house. It was a house trained to guard grief, to keep it brushed, folded, and ready like mourning silk laid out for constant use. At breakfast the next day, the Duke was absent. A servant informed her that his Grace had ridden out before dawn. Lady Agnes sent word that a headache confined her. Mrs. Finch, perhaps judging that idleness would do more harm than labor, asked whether her Grace wished to inspect the household stores. Eleanor said yes at once. If she could not reach the heart of the Abbey, she would learn its bones. So they went through still-room, linen press, dairy books, candle inventory, winter jam shelves, and the steward's neat stacks of tenant accounts awaiting signature. Everything was orderly, but too much had been preserved instead of renewed. In the blue drawing room, the curtains had faded on one side and never been replaced. In the nursery corridor, a cracked pane had been papered over against the draught. In the west gallery, a runner had worn thin enough to catch a careless heel. Eleanor noticed, asked, remembered. Mrs. Finch's reserve eased by a degree. Useful duchesses, after all, were easier to live with than ornamental ones. Near noon they came to a pair of tall double doors on the east side, painted cream once, but now dimmed by time. White Holland covers had been pinned over the carved panels, as if even wood must be protected from memory. A brass keyhole glinted at eye level. Mrs. Finch stopped walking. "That room is kept closed, Your Grace." "The music room?" The housekeeper looked at her quickly. "We do not call it so." Eleanor let her fingers rest against the covered panel. The cloth was cool and faintly dusty. Beyond it lay no sound at all. Yet the silence there was dense, almost physical, like air in a church before the first prayer. She withdrew her hand. "Who keeps the key?" Mrs. Finch folded her hands more tightly. "His Grace." Nothing more could be got from her then. They moved on. In the sewing room, where afternoon light fell yellow over baskets of mending, an elderly seamstress rose awkwardly to curtsy. Her name was Barlow, and she had stitched for the late Duchess before ever Eleanor set foot in the Abbey. While showing neatly darned christening linen that would now never be used for its first purpose, the old woman's eyes filled for one instant. "Her late Grace was to have worn pearl gray for the chapel," she murmured, almost to herself. "She said the sonata must be finished before." Mrs. Finch dropped a bundle of folded sheets onto the table with a sharp crack. Mrs. Barlow went white. And from the passage outside came the unmistakable sound of a key turning slowly in a lock. The sewing room went still at once. Mrs. Finch did not gasp this time. She drew herself upright, smoothed the front of her gown, and gave Mrs. Barlow one warning look so swift and sharp it barely seemed to move her face at all. Eleanor turned toward the passage. The sound had come from the east side, beyond the stretch of corridor where the air always seemed cooler. Another turn of the key followed. Then the soft, inward groan of a heavy door opened after long disuse. The Duke stood there. He had removed his gloves, but still carried them in one hand. Damp from the weather darkened the shoulders of his coat. For the smallest moment he looked from Mrs. Finch to the seamstress and then to Eleanor, and she had the odd sense that he understood the shape of the interrupted conversation without hearing a single word of it. Behind him, through the narrow angle of the open door, she saw only shadow and a pale fall of covered furniture beneath Holland sheets. "The room is to be aired," he said. Mrs. Finch curtsied. "Yes, Your Grace." "For the memorial." There it was again, that tightening in the room whenever the chapel or the coming service was named. Agnes had spoken of it as a matter of form. In his mouth it sounded like penance. Mrs. Barlow bent over the folded linen as if her old hands had become very busy all at once. Eleanor said nothing, though the words sonata and before still rang in her mind. The Duke's gaze rested on her a second longer than custom required. "You have been shown the house?" "In part?" "In part will do for today." The dismissal was not rude, only firm, yet when he turned back toward the open door, he paused, as though some habit in him expected another presence at his shoulder, someone who would follow him in without invitation. He did not look behind. He stepped inside, and Mrs. Finch moved at once to close the sewing-room shutters against the draught, as if ordinary labor must hurry back into place before feelings spread any farther. By late afternoon, a pale sun had come through, touching the upper windows with thin gold. Eleanor asked to walk in the south garden and was given a maid at a respectful distance. The gravel was damp beneath her half-boots. Rosemary brushed her skirts where the herb beds crowded the path. From the yew hedge she could see the chapel roof, gray and severe against a whitening sky. It struck her then that all roads in this household curved back toward the same three places: the chapel, the curtained corridor, and the room no one dared name plainly. When she returned indoors, Agnes was waiting in the small morning parlor with a cup of untouched tea cooling at her elbow. A fire burned low. The windows smelled faintly of rain and soot. "My brother-in-law has opened the room," Agnes said, without preamble. "That is unfortunate." Eleanor took the chair opposite her. "For whom?" Agnes gave a soft laugh. "For any woman vain enough to think grief leaves vacancies to be filled." The words were smooth, but beneath them lived something rougher, something close to fear. Eleanor saw it this time. Possession. Then Agnes reached into the pocket of her black silk gown and laid a single folded sheet of music on the table between them. The ink had browned with age. The page ended halfway down, as if the hand that wrote it had been forced to stop. "My sister left many things unfinished," Agnes said. "You would do well not to touch what is beyond you." Eleanor did not touch the page at once. It lay between the teacups like a challenge and a warning both, the old paper faintly curled at one corner, the lines of music drawn in brown-black ink that had softened with time. Agnes watched her with that grave, polished composure she wore so well. Outside, a rook called from the lawn, harsh and lonely in the damp air. Inside, the little parlor smelled of coal ash, bergamot, and the dried lavender tucked into the window hangings. At last, Eleanor looked down. She knew enough in one glance to feel her pulse change. The hand was disciplined, elegant, and alive. This had not been copied by some music master for exercise. It had been written by a mind hearing far beyond the bar it had managed to catch. A theme unfolded across the page, sure and clear, then pressed into a more troubled passage. There, halfway through a phrase, the notation broke off. No cadence, no return. Only silence where the thought had meant to go on. "The last fair copy she worked upon," Agnes said quietly. "She was writing for the chapel before her confinement. Wexford could not bear it removed. I could not bear it destroyed." The confession might have sounded tender in another woman. In Agnes, it carried possession. Eleanor lifted her eyes. "Why show it to me?" "Because I prefer plain dealings. You are young enough to mistake pity for invitation." Agnes folded her gloved hands. "My sister was accomplished. She did not make music to charm a drawing room. She understood devotion, restraint, reverence. Since she died, those things have had to be defended in this house. And from me? Agnes's mouth bent, barely. From anyone who might imagine talent gives them a claim. Eleanor felt the words strike where they were aimed, yet beneath the sting came something else, something sharper. Agnes had not brought the page to humiliate her alone. She had brought it because she was afraid of what another musician might see in it. That thought settled quietly, and once it settled, it did not leave. She returned the sheet untouched. "Then keep it safe, Lady Agnes." A flicker passed over the older woman's face, surprise, almost irritation that the bait had not been taken. She rose soon after, gathering the music back into her sleeve pocket with deliberate care. Before she left, she paused by the door. "The Year's Mind Memorial is in early autumn," she said. "Guests will come from every neighboring estate, clergy, tenants, relations. Wexford will endure that day because it is expected of him. I advise you to be ornamental and obedient." When the door closed, Eleanor remained where she was for some moments, staring at the tea gone cold in her cup. Then she stood and crossed to the window. From there lay the chapel path, the clipped yews, and beyond them the high east windows of the shuttered corridor. The page had shown her more than Agnes intended. Clara had not merely played, she had composed. She had written for that chapel. And somewhere beyond those covered doors, beyond the careful prohibitions and the household fear, the rest of that music might still exist. That evening, when Eleanor went upstairs, she found Mrs. Finch waiting outside her room with a ring of linen keys in hand and a question in her eyes she did not quite dare ask. Instead, the housekeeper only said, very low, "If your Grace has any need of old account books, the cabinets in the schoolroom have not been sorted since her late Grace's time." And then she placed one small brass key on Eleanor's dressing table. Not the Duke's heavy East Corridor key, but one slender enough to fit a music folio drawer. Eleanor waited until the house had settled into its evening habits before she tried the little brass key. The schoolroom lay in the older wing, above the side garden and below the attics, a square room with faded maps on the walls and a smell of chalk, cold hearth ash, and old paste. Moonlight pressed pale bars through the window panes. The cabinets Mrs. Finch had mentioned stood beneath a shelf of copybooks and slates, their walnut fronts dulled by years of handling. The second drawer on the left resisted at first, then yielded with a dry scrape. Inside were household memoranda tied in blue ribbon, old music copy paper, and a leather portfolio worn soft at the corners. Her hands slowed as she lifted it out. There was no name on the cover. There did not need to be. The first sheets held hymn settings in a fine, steady hand, marked for village voices, alto here, tenors there. One note changed in pencil where someone had clearly heard the line more kindly than it had first been written. Beneath them lay practice books, a list of children from the parish choir, and several folded pages headed for chapel use. Clara had worked then with purpose, not for applause. For this house, this parish, those plain people whose lives touched the Abbey only on feast days and funerals. Eleanor could almost see her at this schoolroom table, sleeves pinned back, candle burning low, listening inward before setting pen to stave. At the bottom of the portfolio she found it, a second fragment of the same composition Agnes had shown her. This one carried the opening theme farther, then broke into a stormier middle passage, rich and searching, before ending in hurried corrections and a line drawn through two bars so hard the nib had nearly torn the paper. On the reverse, in smaller script, were chapel notes for the Year's Mind Memorial Service, then intended months before Clara died, psalm choices, seating for tenants, and one unfinished line. After the prayer, the sonata to be played complete. Eleanor sat back slowly on the old schoolroom chair. Its cane seat creaked beneath her. The room felt close all at once. Agnes had told only part of the truth. Clara had not been writing some private amusement. She had meant the piece for the chapel, for a public act of devotion, perhaps even for reconciliation of some kind. And someone in the household had hidden these pages away where Agnes had not found them, or had not wished to admit she knew. A floorboard sounded in the corridor outside, not the light step of a maid, heavier, deliberate. Eleanor had just enough time to slide the fragment beneath the hymn papers when the schoolroom door opened, and the Duke of Wexford, still in black, stood on the threshold with a candle in his hand and his eyes fixed on the portfolio in her lap. The candle flame stirred once in the draught from the open door, and neither of them spoke. Wexford's gaze moved from Eleanor's face to the portfolio, then to the drawer left half open beneath the cabinet. He was not angry in the simple sense. Anger would have been easier. What crossed his features was more guarded than that, as though he had come upon a room inside himself that he had nailed shut and found the boards loosened. The wax from his candle ran warm over his knuckles. She could smell damp wool from his coat and the faint, clean scent of night air that had followed him in from the terrace. "At this hour?" he said at last. The schoolroom was not occupied. It was not quite an answer, and they both knew it. Still, he stepped farther inside instead of calling for Mrs. Finch or demanding the key. His boots made little sound on the worn boards. "You were told the east side is not for you." "This is not the east side." A pause, then, unexpectedly, the shadow of something almost like weary amusement touched his mouth and vanished. "You reason like a clergyman's daughter." "I was taught to observe the wording of rules, Your Grace." That earned her his full attention. Briefly, the room narrowed to candlelight, chalk dust, and the silence between them. Then he set the candle on the schoolmaster's desk and held out his hand. "What have you found?" Eleanor hesitated only a breath before giving him the top sheets. He stood beneath the map of the counties and read through the choir lists first, his expression unreadable. Then he came to Clara's notations for chapel use. His thumb stopped on the unfinished line. The whole of him seemed to still around it. "She worked everywhere," he said quietly. "Not only in that room." It was the first unforced thing he had said about his late wife in Eleanor's hearing. His voice had changed, too. The clipped authority had dropped away, leaving something lower, roughened by memory. He turned another page and found the fragment she had tried to hide beneath the hymn papers. He did not accuse her. He simply looked at the bars on the page as though they might reopen a wound by sight alone. "She meant to play this at the chapel," Eleanor said. His jaw tightened. "So I see. Lady Agnes told me it was left unfinished." A muscle moved near his temple. "Agnes says many things in the language of protection." "And are they true?" He gave no answer at once. The candle between them hissed softly as a drop of wax fell against the brass stick. Outside, somewhere in the courtyard, a horse stamped in its stall. At length he laid the sheets back into the portfolio with more care than anger would have allowed. "My wife died before the child quickened properly," he said, still looking down. "The physicians spoke in circles. Clara understood before I did. She asked for her writing case from the music room the night before she took to her bed." His hand closed once on the edge of the desk. "I never asked what she worked on. I thought there would be time." The confession hung there, bare and terrible in its simplicity. Eleanor felt her own breath catch. This was no polished grief for chapel stone and black gloves. This was the blunt edge of a man who had missed his last chance without knowing it was the last. Then he lifted his head, and something in his face had gone cold again, quickly, almost by habit. "You will leave these where you found them," he said, "and you will not go searching farther." He turned toward the door, took up the candle, and should have gone. Instead, he stopped on the threshold and added without looking back, "If Agnes gave you a page, she meant to provoke you. Tell me, madam, did it succeed?" He asked it without heat, and that made it harder to answer. Eleanor rose from the schoolroom chair slowly, the old cane seat sighing beneath her as she stood. The candle in his hand threw wavering gold across the maps on the wall and left the corners of the room in gray shadow. Dust hung in the air between them. The fragment of music lay hidden beneath hymn papers at her elbow, and she had the odd, sharp feeling that she was being tested over something larger than a page. "Yes," she said. His brows shifted, only slightly. "In what manner?" "In the manner intended." That might have been insolence from another woman. From her it came plain and calm, and he knew it. She saw the struggle move across his face again, that swift pull between defense and truth. He stepped back into the room and set the candle more firmly down, as if he had accepted that he would not leave yet. "Agnes believes every disturbance to be an invasion," he said. "And do you?" He looked toward the portfolio instead of at her. "I believe some things are best left where grief has placed them." The answer might have ended the matter. It did not. Perhaps because the hour was late. Perhaps because candlelight makes confidences of ordinary words. Or perhaps because, in that bare schoolroom with its child copybooks and forgotten music paper, the grand forms of Duke and Duchess did not hold quite so firmly as they did in the dining room. Eleanor said, "If grief placed them, why were they hidden in a cabinet?" That struck home. She saw it. His hand tightened once around his gloves. After a silence, he gave the smallest shake of his head, not in denial, but in weary acknowledgement. "Because my wife wrote in many rooms, and the house kept what I could not bear to sort." It was as near to helplessness as she had yet heard from him. The words stirred something gentler in her, though not enough to ease the bruise he had made at the beginning. She remembered too clearly the rain-dark afternoon in the vicarage, the absurd command delivered over account papers, the part of her life barred before she ever crossed his threshold. Still, she could not look at the man before her now and mistake him for merely cruel. There was injury in him, old and unhealed, and others had learned to live around it like people arranging furniture around a cracked floor they dared not step upon. "She meant the piece for the chapel," Eleanor said more softly. "Did she ever play it for you?" His eyes lifted to hers then, and for a moment she thought he might answer. Instead, he said, "No, Clara never played incomplete work before anyone." A silence followed. Then, surprising them both, he asked, "Did you understand it?" "Not hear it, not read it. Understand it." Eleanor felt her pulse quicken. "Enough to know it stops where it did not wish to stop." Something like pain crossed his mouth. He turned away at once, but too late to hide it fully. "That," he said, "might be said of more than music." He reached for the portfolio, closed it with care, and returned it to her hands rather than the drawer. The gesture was small. It altered the air all the same. "In future," he said, and his voice had gone formal again, "if you wish to inspect household records, do so by daylight." Then he left. The next morning, when Eleanor came down to breakfast, she found a neatly folded paper placed beside her plate. It was not in the steward's hand, nor Mrs. Finch's. It was a list of parish repairs the Abbey had neglected for months, and at the bottom, written in the Duke's own severe script, 4 unexpected words: "Ask the chapel organist." The note lay beside her coffee cup like a door left ajar. Eleanor read the 4 words twice, then folded the paper along the crease his hand had already made. The breakfast room was bright with a thin autumn sun, and the silver coffee pot reflected the window in a warped strip of white. Across from her, Wexford was absent again. He had the habit now of leaving instructions in place of company, which was its own strange form of attention. Mrs. Finch, moving quietly between sideboard and table, saw the note disappear into Eleanor's sleeve and gave no sign of having seen it. The chapel organist lived in a narrow stone house beyond the lower gate, where the abbey land gave way to the village lane. His name was Mr. Bell, a spare man with pale lashes and hands permanently stained by polish, lamp-black, and old varnish. He smelled of wool, cedar shavings, and the faint metallic tang of pipes. When Eleanor called under the proper pretext of parish repairs, he bowed her into a parlor crowded with hymn books, cracked music stands, and a dismantled pedal board propped against the wall. At first he was cautious. Everyone at Wexford Abbey had become cautious by training. But the moment she asked whether the late duchess had ever written for the chapel, something in his lined face changed. "Oh, yes, Your Grace," he said softly. "Her late Grace wrote for the place the way some folk pray, careful and with all of herself." He went to a shelf, drew out a ledger, and opened it with reverent fingers. Between repair accounts and tuning dates were scraps of Clara's hand copied into his own, registrations for feast days, notes on echo beneath the south arch, a reminder that the old square pianoforte in the vestry should be kept covered against damp. Eleanor felt her breath catch at that. "There is an instrument in the chapel?" "For choir practice mostly. A modest thing, badly neglected now." He glanced at her face and then away. Before the tragedy, her ladyship meant to use it in rehearsal. The chapel carries intimate music better than the great salon ever did." He hesitated, then added, "There was a piece she was working toward, never named it to me, only said it must end in light, else it would not be honest." "End in light." Eleanor held the phrase close. Mr. Bell looked toward the door and lowered his voice. "Lady Agnes told His Grace the work ought to be sealed away. Said unfinished music was the cruelest sort, because it teaches people to hope for what cannot be restored." His Grace said nothing. After that, no one asked me to tune the vestry instrument again. When Eleanor rose to leave, he walked her as far as the path. The air outside smelled of wet leaves and distant peat smoke. From the chapel tower, a rook lifted and vanished into the whitening sky. "There is one more thing," he said, almost reluctantly. "A week before her confinement, her late Grace asked me whether I believed another hand might ever finish a thought begun by the dead." Eleanor turned to him fully. Mr. Bell swallowed. "I told her only if the living loved truth more than ownership." When Eleanor returned to the Abbey, the east corridor stood open for the first time in days, and from somewhere within that shadowed stretch came Agnes's voice, low, urgent, and angry enough that even the servants had withdrawn. She slowed before the turn of the passage and did not step into view at once. The east corridor held its own kind of chill, a dry cold that smelled of old plaster, shut windows, and lavender gone stale in linen presses. One of the wall lamps had been lit, though dusk had not yet quite fallen, and its small flame threw uncertain light over the holland-draped chairs and the long runner beneath Eleanor's feet. Agnes's voice came from the open doorway ahead, low and strained enough that each word seemed pressed through clenched teeth. Wexford answered more softly. That somehow made the quarrel feel more dangerous. "You cannot mean to reopen all this now," Agnes was saying. "Not after the order we have kept." "The order," he replied, "has not restored anything." A pause followed. Eleanor could hear the faint knock of something wooden being set down inside the room. A box, perhaps, or a stool. Agnes spoke again, sharper now. "You are changing because she has begun to prowl where she ought not. I warned you what would happen if you brought a girl with accomplishments into this house." The words struck Eleanor with a cold, clean force. Not because they were new, but because they were spoken here, before that open room, as if she were not a wife, but a hazard. Still, she did not retreat. Some truths are best overheard. You know that, I think. They arrive stripped of politeness. Wexford's answer came after a silence too long to be comfortable. You warned me against weather, against callers, against servants with memories. You warn against any breath that is not yours. Agnes laughed then, a brittle little sound. I have protected Clara. You have protected your version of Clara. That was the first outright blow, and the corridor seemed to tighten around it. Eleanor moved one step nearer the door. Through the narrow angle of it she could see part of the chamber beyond at last, the edge of a pianoforte under its faded cover, a tall window filmed with dust light, a music stand with nothing on it, and Agnes standing rigid in black silk, one hand on the back of a chair as if claiming the space by touch. She is gone, Agnes said. The least we can do is keep what she left untouched. No, he said. That single word landed heavier than anger. Eleanor had never heard him speak so plainly. Inside the room, Agnes's face altered. For a moment, the fine control slipped, and what showed beneath it was grief sharpened into hunger. And what is the alternative? To let your new duchess sit where Clara sat? To let her lay hands on the instrument and pretend mercy? At that, Wexford turned enough that Eleanor saw his profile. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. No one has spoken of pretending mercy. Agnes's gaze shifted past him then, straight to the doorway, straight to Eleanor. There was no help for it now. She stepped forward fully into the light. For one suspended instant, the three of them stood joined by the same breathless stillness. Agnes flushed with fury, Wexford arrested mid-turn, Eleanor with her gloves still in hand, and Mr. Bell's words echoing in her mind. Only if the living loved truth more than ownership. Then Agnes, with terrible calm, reached to the music stand beside her and lifted a thick sheaf of manuscript pages. If truth is wanted, she said, perhaps your grace should see what your wife was writing in secret before the child was born. No one moved. The pages in Agnes's hand gave a dry, papery rustle in the stillness, and that small sound seemed loud enough to wake the whole house. Wexford stood, half turned toward Eleanor, half toward the room behind him, caught as if two claims had been laid upon him at once. The lamp on the wall flickered. A thread of cold air slipped under the door from the window beyond, carrying the smell of dust, old polish, and dried roses gone brown in a bowl no one had thought to empty. "What pages?" he said. Agnes lifted the sheaf a little higher. Her black sleeves fell back from her wrists, showing hands that were elegant and bloodless with tension. Her own? Not the household copies, not the little village hymns you found charming to indulge. These she kept apart. She told me once that if you saw them too soon, you would misunderstand. The cruelty of that was expertly chosen. Eleanor heard it at once. Agnes did not mean only to wound the Duke with mystery. She meant to restore herself as the sole keeper of what Clara had truly been. Wexford looked at the pages as if they might indeed contain some final verdict from the dead. "Give them to me," he said. Agnes did not obey immediately. "Before I do, I want your wife to hear this." Clara knew she might not survive the confinement. She was not blind, however much the physician dressed danger in soft phrases. She wrote while there was still time. She put into these pages what she could not say aloud without distressing you. Eleanor saw the blow before it landed. A husband learns that his dying wife spared him. A sister becomes the witness to what he was not trusted to hear. It was almost too neat, too polished. Truth seldom arranges itself with such theatrical grace. Still, the pain on Wexford's face was real enough. He held out his hand again. Agnes. That one word ended the performance. She gave him the pages. He took them with visible care, then stepped farther into the room, where the last of the evening light reached across the covered pianoforte. Eleanor remained at the threshold. Now she saw what the corridor had hidden from her all these weeks. The room was larger than she had imagined, though grief had made it feel narrow. A green silk shade hung over a reading lamp. Music folios stood in a glass-fronted cabinet. On the mantel rested a small plaster cast of a child's hand, unfinished at the wrist. The sight of it stopped her breath for an instant. Wexford began to read. At first his expression did not change. Then, slowly, line by line, the set of his mouth altered. Confusion came first, then disbelief, then something rawer. He looked up at Agnes. "This is not a farewell," he said. Agnes's chin lifted. "It is truth. It is a plan." The words seemed to strike all three of them. Eleanor felt it at once. A plan for what? She saw staves and annotations on the top page now, not the shape of a private confession, but notes, timings, chapel positions, and beneath them several lines in Clara's hand written with unusual force. Wexford turned the page with fingers that were no longer steady. "She was designing the service," he said, almost to himself. "The readings, the sequence, the instrumental response after the final prayer." His voice thinned. "Agnes, this was not hidden from me because she feared I would misunderstand. It was unfinished because she ran out of time." Agnes opened her mouth to answer, but Eleanor saw before she heard it the tiny square of paper that slipped loose from the center of the sheaf and drifted to the floor between them. A separate note, sealed, addressed in Clara's own hand to whoever should first hear the piece completed. The little sealed note seemed to draw all the air toward it. It had fallen face up on the threadbare carpet, no larger than a visiting card, the cream paper gone faintly yellow at the edges. Clara's hand was clear, even from where Eleanor stood, stronger than Agnes's, less ornamental, with a firmness that belonged to a woman accustomed to making thought visible. Wexford stared at it as if afraid to bend. Agnes did not move either. For one moment all her arguments, all her careful arranging of grief, were powerless before a thing she had not meant to surrender. Eleanor stepped forward first. She did it without asking herself whether she had the right. Sometimes the body decides before pride can interfere. She bent, lifted the note, and felt the brittle seal press lightly against her glove. It had not been broken. That fact landed between them with more force than any accusation. Agnes had possessed these pages, perhaps for months, perhaps longer, and still had not opened the one thing Clara had truly closed for another hand. "To whom is it addressed?" Wexford asked. Eleanor looked down. The words were brief. "To whoever hears it," ended. Silence followed. Even Agnes could not pretend now that the dead woman had meant secrecy for secrecy's own sake. This was instruction, or hope, or both. "Give it to me," Agnes said. Wexford's head lifted at once. "No." The word was quiet, but it held. Agnes flushed. "It may be nothing, a whim. Clara wrote many things when she was tired." "You said a moment ago these were truths too delicate for me," he answered. "Now they are whims?" The room felt changed again, altered, not healed or safe, as if one shutter had been unlatched and a draft had entered that no one could stop. Eleanor crossed the last few steps and placed the sealed note in Wexford's outstretched hand. Their fingers brushed, only that, and yet she felt the shock of it plainly. His skin was cold. He turned the note over once, looking at the seal. This should be opened in private. Agnes made a low sound of protest. After all this, you mean to exclude me? His face closed. I mean to grant Clara one room not governed by your interpretations. The blow landed cleanly. Agnes drew herself up so straight that her black silk whispered at the seams. For a second, Eleanor thought she would leave in grand offense. Instead, she looked at Eleanor with naked dislike and something closer to alarm. You do not know what you are encouraging, she said. Some wounds are bound for a reason. Then she swept past them and out into the corridor, her skirts brushing the runner like an extinguished flame. Wexford did not call her back. He stood by the covered pianoforte with the note in one hand and the manuscript pages in the other, looking suddenly less like a duke than a man left alone in a room too full of ghosts. The late light from the window had thinned to gray. Dust floated above the instrument lid. On the mantel, the little cast of the baby's hand caught the last pale gleam. At length he said, still not looking at Eleanor, "If I open this now, I cannot pretend afterward that nothing is altered." She answered softly, "I do not believe anything here has remained unchanged for a very long time." That brought his eyes to hers. There was fatigue in them, and resistance, and a kind of fragile honesty that had not been there before. He broke the seal. Inside lay a single folded sheet, not a farewell or a confession. Music. One page only, and across the top, in Clara's hand, 2 words, "For completion." Wexford read the words once, then again, as though the page might change if he looked long enough. It was not a complete sheet of music. Clara had written only a handful of bars, then marked above them in a quick, decisive hand what should follow: fragments of harmony, a returning theme, a line of instruction so plain it made Eleanor's throat tighten. Take the chapel theme home by another road. Let it grieve, then let it rise. Beneath that, smaller, almost as if added at the last moment, if my hand fails, let another finish honestly. No one spoke. The last line altered the whole room. It stripped Agnes of authority in a single stroke. Clara had not wished her work embalmed. She had not wanted silence kept around it like glass over a relic. She had expected interruption, feared it, prepared for it, and asked for continuation. Wexford lowered the page very slowly. In the dim room, his face looked carved out of fatigue and astonishment. Agnes recovered first. She was ill. She cannot have meant. She meant exactly what she wrote, he said. His voice was not loud, but Eleanor heard something new in it, weariness with false custody. Agnes's cheeks lost color. You are letting that girl's presence distort everything. At that, Wexford turned toward Eleanor, and the turn itself felt significant. He did not hide the page. He did not send her away. He simply looked at her with a kind of grave attention that had never been given freely before. Can you read this? The question fell into her like a stone into water, sending rings through every guarded part of her. Agnes made a sound of outrage at once. Eleanor felt it and ignored it. She crossed the room only after the briefest pause, aware of the old carpet under her slippers, the dusty rose scent trapped in the curtains, the covered bulk of the instrument beside her. When Wexford held the page out, she took it with careful fingers and read. Clara's thinking was clear, even in fragments, even interrupted. The bars she had managed on the page belonged to the troubled center of the work, not its end. She had mapped the return without writing it fully. Anyone with vanity might have mistaken the invitation for license. Anyone with true ear would hear the burden in it. This was not permission to display. It was a plea for fidelity. Yes, Eleanor said softly. I can read it. Agnes took a step forward. That proves nothing. No, Eleanor answered, still looking at the page. It proves only that your sister expected the music to live beyond her." The words were plain, but they changed the air again. Agnes stiffened as though struck. Wexford went very still. For a moment Eleanor feared she had gone too far, spoken with too much certainty in a room where she was still, after all, the second wife and newcomer. Then she felt his gaze on her face, steady and unreadable. "Tell me," he said, "if it were to be finished, would it sound like Clara?" There was no trap in the question. That made it harder than any challenge. Eleanor lifted her eyes to his. "Only if the hand that finished it loved truth more than itself." He drew breath as if the answer hurt him. From somewhere down the corridor came the muffled striking of the dinner gong. None of them moved toward it. Agnes's eyes had narrowed with sudden comprehension, and in that instant she understood what Eleanor understood too. The danger was no longer that the past might be opened. The danger was that Wexford might allow it. Then he reached past Eleanor to the covered pianoforte, took hold of the faded cloth and pulled it back. The cloth slid down in a slow whisper and settled in a gray heap at their feet. For the first time, Eleanor saw the instrument uncovered. The wood was dark and deep-toned, rubbed dull in places where hands had once rested often. Candlelight found the curve of the lid, the brass hinge, the faint scratches near the keyboard where rings or hurried pages must once have brushed it. The room smelled of old polish, paper, and the dry sweetness of flowers left too long in a closed place. One ivory key had yellowed more than the others. Another bore the smallest hairline crack. It was simply a pianoforte that had been loved, neglected, and feared. Agnes made a sharp step forward. "Wexford?" He ignored her. "Enough." The word held her where she stood. Eleanor had never seen authority and pain live so plainly in the same breath. He rested his hand on the instrument's edge, not playing, not even lifting the fallboard, only touching the polished wood as though testing whether memory would strike him dead. His face had gone very still. "She wrote for completion," he said. No one answered. At length he turned to Eleanor. The room, the pages, the hidden fragments, Agnes's watchfulness, all of it seemed to narrow toward that single look. "You asked whether Agnes's page provoked you. Perhaps I should have asked something else." She waited. "Did it call to you?" The honesty of the question startled her more than any command had done. He was not asking whether she desired to disobey him. He was asking whether music itself had reached for her across all his rules and all this household's dread. Eleanor could have answered with pride or caution. Instead, she chose truth. "Yes," she said. "It did." Agnes gave a disbelieving laugh. "And there it is. You have invited temptation into Clara's room and call it candor." Wexford's gaze did not leave Eleanor's face. "If I asked whether the page could be understood without touching the instrument, what would you say?" "That some of it can," she answered. "A trained eye hears a little inwardly, but not all. Not the weight of the return. Not whether the last bars are faithful or merely clever." He closed his eyes for one brief second. When he opened them, there was resolve there, and fear beneath it. "Then we will proceed without vanity and without deceit." Agnes stared. "Proceed?" He turned at last toward her. "The pages will be gathered. Mr. Bell will be called to the chapel, and this room will not be shut again." Color rose high in Agnes's cheeks. "You cannot mean to let her meddle in Clara's work." "I mean to learn what Clara intended before anyone else decides it for me." It was the nearest thing to accusation he had yet spoken, and Agnes heard it for what it was. Her lips parted, then closed. Eleanor felt the whole house shifting under that silence, room by room, servant by servant, as if walls long braced against one weather were being asked to endure another. Then Wexford did something stranger still. He lifted the fall board. The keys lay before them in pale rows, quiet and waiting. His hand hovered above them, not to play, but to guard. He looked at Eleanor once more, and in his face she saw struggle, memory, and the first hard edge of trust. "Do not touch it," he said softly. "Not yet." Then with his other hand, he drew from his coat pocket a small iron key and set it on the music stand beside Clara's page. "The vestry instrument," he said. "Mr. Bell may need it sooner than I thought." After that, nothing in the Abbey remained quite where it had been. At first, dinner was still served on polished silver. Mrs. Finch still moved through the passages with her ring of keys and her grave economy. Agnes still appeared in black silk and spoke of propriety as though she had invented it. But servants began to lift their eyes when Eleanor passed. Doors that had once closed before she reached them now stood open a breath longer. And in the chapel vestry, under Mr. Bell's muttered inspection, the little square pianoforte was uncovered, dusted, and coaxed back toward usefulness. Eleanor did not touch it. That mattered. It mattered to her, and, more strangely, it seemed to matter to Wexford. He had set the key before her, but he had also said, "Not yet," and she kept to the letter of that command with the same stubborn precision she had always brought to injury. Instead, she worked. She gathered household lists, chapel notes, old choir copies, and every scrap of Clara's music Mr. Bell could identify without guesswork. In the mornings, she oversaw stores, linen, coal allotments, nursery repairs. In the afternoons, she walked to the chapel, where the air smelled of damp stone, candle wax, and the faint iron tang of old brass. There, beside the chancel arch, Mr. Bell would spread pages across a pew and talk in low tones about keys, phrasing, echoes beneath the south wall. She favored clarity, he told her once, tapping a notation with his blunt forefinger. Even when she wrote sorrow, she never muddied it. Her ladyship believed grief ought to be heard plainly, else folk mistake obscurity for depth. Eleanor smiled despite herself. "That sounds like something a composer would say." "It sounds like someone who had been contradicted by clergymen and survived." The small warmth of that remark stayed with her longer than it should have. So did other small things. A shawl appeared in the vestry one windy afternoon, folded over the bench where she sorted pages. No note came with it, but the wool was of the sort Wexford wore riding. On another day, the cracked chapel step she had mentioned in passing was already repaired by evening. He did not ask whether she noticed. She did. Agnes noticed too. One evening, as Eleanor returned from the chapel with ink on her glove and 3 copied bars turning over in her head, Agnes intercepted her in the west gallery where the light had gone amber across the portraits. "You are being humored," she said. "Do not mistake that for welcome." Eleanor met her without lowering her eyes. "I have never mistaken it." Agnes's mouth thinned. "Then understand this. If he hears that piece completed, he will hear Clara lost again. You think you offer healing. You offer rupture." The words might have been simple malice. There was fear in them, real fear. For a moment, Eleanor almost pitied her. Almost. That night, when the house had gone quiet, she sat at her dressing table with Clara's copied phrases before her and did the one thing no one could forbid. She listened inwardly. Theme answering theme, the chapel line returning altered. That instruction at the top of the page, "Take the chapel theme home by another road. Let it grieve, then let it rise." A knock came at her door, a man's sure rap, nothing timid or practical in it. The Duke's voice followed, low through the panel. "If you are awake, madam, I would have your judgment on something I found in the nursery fire grate." She opened the door at once. Wexford stood in the candlelit passage with a small blackened object wrapped in a handkerchief. He had come without a servant, without ceremony, his hair still damp at the temples from recent washing, his coat unbuttoned as if he had dressed again in haste after undressing for the night. The sight of him like that, less armored, almost human in the old ordinary sense, caught Eleanor off guard more than the summons had done. "I beg pardon for the hour," he said. "You would not have come if it were trifling." A faint change touched his face at that, something near a smile. He stepped inside when she moved aside, and the room filled with the scent of cold air, wool, and the faint smoke from the nursery grate where, it seemed, he had been searching through ashes with his own hands. He set the blackened bundle on her dressing table and unfolded the linen. Inside lay a metronome, or what had been one. The varnish was blistered on one side, the brass pendulum smoke dark, the glass panel cracked in a web from top to bottom. Yet the shape was unmistakable. Eleanor remembered at once the faint ticking behind the east curtain on her first night, the hidden pulse in a house determined to deny its own heartbeat. "It was in the nursery," he said, "at the back of the grate, as if someone meant to burn it and failed." Eleanor touched the scorched wood lightly with one fingertip. It was cold now, but soot came away black against her skin. "Clara's?" "Yes." He said the name without flinching this time. That, too, was new. "I had never seen it there," he went on. "The nursery was sealed after—" He did not finish. He did not need to. "Mrs. Finch says the room was entered only twice afterward, once by Agnes, once by the maids to close the shutters before winter." Eleanor looked up. "And why bring it to me?" "Because you hear patterns where I have heard only interruption." The words settled between them quietly. There was trust in them, unwilling perhaps, but real. She examined the instrument more closely, turning it toward the candle. Under the scorch, near the base, something pale showed where flame had not taken properly. She fetched her hand mirror from the dressing table and angled the light across it. Faint pencil marks emerged, a set of numbers. Then a line in Clara's hand so small it might have been overlooked by anyone not searching. For timing, not for mourning. Eleanor felt a chill pass cleanly down her back. "This was not kept for memory," she said. "It was marked for rehearsal." Wexford came a little closer, close enough that she could feel the heat of him near her shoulder as he bent to look. Neither of them seemed aware of the nearness until it was already there. The silence changed, softer, more dangerous in a different way. "Rehearsal for what?" he asked. She turned the metronome slightly. More of the writing showed, smudged but legible enough when the candle steadied. A date, now useless. Beneath it, only 2 words. "Final Chapel." They both understood at once. Clara had set this not in the music room, not for private study, but for the chapel performance itself. Someone had taken it from there afterward, hidden it, tried to destroy it. Wexford straightened slowly. In the mirror, Eleanor caught the reflection of his face before he looked away. "Agnes said my wife wished silence kept as a memorial," he said. "But if this belonged to the chapel—" He did not finish. He did not need to. Eleanor folded the handkerchief back around the metronome, but before she could speak there came a hurried knock at her door. Mrs. Finch's voice, low and breathless through the panel. "Your Grace, Lady Agnes has sent for the carriage. She means to leave before dawn, and she is carrying a locked dispatch box from the music room." Mrs. Finch had never sounded breathless before. That, more than the words themselves, sent them both moving. Wexford was out the door almost before Eleanor had drawn her wrapper close, and she followed with the handkerchief-wrapped metronome still in her grasp. The corridor beyond her room was dim, lit only by 2 wall lamps burning low, their chimneys filmed with soot. Shadows from the banister fell in black bars across the landing. Somewhere below, a carriage horse stamped in the yard and shook its harness with a muffled clink. Mrs. Finch stood halfway down the stairs, one hand hard on the rail. "She has taken Dawson with her," she whispered, "and the small dispatch box from the escritoire in the music room. She told the maids she means to travel before the roads worsen." Wexford did not waste words. "Where is she now?" "At the front hall." They went down together. Eleanor felt the old boards answer under their steps, the wool runner soft beneath her slippers, the cold of the banister under her free hand. In the hall below, the great doors stood open to a damp black night. Wind pressed a scatter of dead leaves over the threshold. Footmen hovered at the edges of the lamplight, uncertain whom to obey. Lady Agnes, veiled and gloved, stood beside a cloaked servant carrying a lacquered box against his chest. She turned when she heard them. For one sharp instant no one spoke. The hall smelled of rain, wet leather, and the faint mineral chill of stone after dark. Agnes's face, under its traveling bonnet, was pale and composed again. She had dressed herself in departure as neatly as she dressed herself in grief. "You are making a scene," she said to Wexford. "No," he answered. "I am preventing one." His gaze fell to the box. "Set that down, Dawson." The servant looked stricken. Agnes cut in at once. "That contains only private correspondence and accounts belonging to my sister's family." "Then you will not object to my seeing them in daylight?" "I object to this house becoming a courtroom for every passing suspicion." Eleanor had kept back until then, but something in the phrasing, "passing suspicion," stiffened her. Agnes had tried to burn the metronome, or had caused it burned. She had hidden pages. She was leaving in the night with a locked box from Clara's room. Whatever tenderness grief once earned her, she had spent it lavishly. Without quite intending to, Eleanor stepped into the lamplight and laid the charred metronome on the hall table between them. Agnes went still, simply still, as if the body knew before the face had arranged its answer. Wexford saw it. So did Eleanor. "This was in the nursery grate," he said, "marked for final chapel rehearsal." Agnes's eyes flicked once toward the wrapped object and back. "I have never seen it." It was the first lie she had told badly. Mrs. Finch lowered her gaze. Dawson shifted his grip on the box. Even the footman, I think, felt the moment turn. All the old rules of rank were still there, yes, but something older was rising under them. The simple household knowledge of who is telling the truth. Wexford extended his hand. "The key." Agnes did not move. Rain whispered beyond the open doors. Somewhere in the dark stable yard a chain struck wood with a lonely knock. Then, very slowly, she smiled. "If you open that box tonight," she said, "you will know why Clara feared the memorial more than death." And she laid the key in his palm. They did not open the box in the hall. Wexford gave one brief order for the doors to be shut and Lady Agnes's carriage to be sent back to the coach-house until morning. His voice stayed level. The servants scattered with that swift, quiet obedience particular to houses where true authority has at last remembered itself. Agnes said nothing more then. She only watched, pale and rigid, as Dawson surrendered the lacquered box and Mrs. Finch carried it behind the Duke as though it were something sacred or dangerous, perhaps both. He took it to the small library beside his study, not the grand family rooms, but a narrower chamber lined with sermon sets, estate maps, and worn calf bindings. A coal fire had burned low there. The room smelled of leather, dust, and cold ashes stirred back to life. Eleanor stood near the hearth with the metronome still wrapped in linen. Agnes remained by the door, gloved hands locked tightly together. Wexford set the box on the writing table and turned the key she had given him. The lock released with a dry click. Inside lay no jewels, no scandalous correspondence, no hidden love tokens. There were music folios tied in faded blue ribbon, Clara's working notebooks, a small packet of chapel seating cards, and beneath them, a folded memorandum in the steward's hand. Wexford took that first. As he read, something flat and disbelieving entered his face. "What is it?" Eleanor asked. He handed her the paper. It was an account of expenditures proposed by Clara for a private memorial service to be held, should she not survive the birth. She had requested alms to village mothers, repairs to the chapel school, music for a single service of remembrance, and after that, ordinary life resumed. In the margin, in another hand, several items had been struck through, the music allocation most heavily of all. Agnes said at once, "She was feverish when that list was made. She could not know what grief would require afterward." Wexford did not look at her. He had opened one of the blue ribbon folios. Page after page held Clara's revisions for the chapel piece, copied more fully than anything Eleanor had yet seen. Farther along, enough to show shape, enough to prove intention. Then he found the last notebook. It was a planner, practical and exact. Liturgical notes, timings, instructions for Mr. Bell, flower placements, and one page marked in thicker ink. "If this is to be my year's mind memorial, let there be no long silence after the prayer. I cannot bear the thought of the house made grave forever. Let the sonata be finished if it may be honestly finished. Let him be brought back by sound, not buried with me in quiet." No one spoke for several seconds. The fire gave a soft collapse in the grate. Agnes's breath had gone shallow enough to hear. Eleanor felt the words move through her with terrible clarity. This was what Clara had feared. Not death alone, but being used afterward to consecrate a living tomb. Wexford lowered the notebook as though it had become heavy in his hands. When he finally turned toward Agnes, the grief in him had changed shape. "You knew," he said. Agnes's chin trembled once before she fixed it. "I knew what was kind." "No," he said, and now there was iron in it. "You knew what let you remain necessary." She flinched. Eleanor thought that would be the end of it for the night. Then Wexford looked down again at the notebook, at the copied pages, at Clara's lines calling him back by sound. His hand closed over the edge of the table. "The memorial is on Sunday," he said quietly, and then he lifted his eyes to Eleanor. "There are 4 days left. Tell me the truth. If the missing bars were placed before you, could the piece be made ready?" The question remained in the room long after he had spoken it. 4 days. The fire had burned low again, and the coals gave off that red, watchful glow that makes every face look more honest than daylight does. Agnes had gone at last, dismissed to her chambers under Mrs. Finch's cold supervision. The house was quiet, though no longer with the old dead hush. This was waiting. The dispatch box lay open on the writing table, Clara's notebook spread beside it, and between those paper ghosts stood a living man asking for truth he might not endure. Eleanor did not answer quickly. She walked to the table and laid her fingers on the edge of one notebook, not reading now, only steadying herself by touch. The paper smelled faintly of dust and iron gall ink. "If the missing bars were placed before me," she said at last, "the piece could be made ready for performance." His face changed, not with relief, not yet, but with the strain of hope entering a man who has not trusted it in a long while. She lifted her eyes to him. "That is not the same as saying it ought to be." He absorbed that without protest. "Tell me why." "Because if it is done poorly, it becomes theft. If it is done for display, it becomes vanity. If it is done to soothe appearances at the year's mind memorial, it insults her twice over." Eleanor drew breath. "And if I attempt it, I will have to hear my way through the places where she left off. I may fail." He listened as though each word cost him something, and yet was wanted all the same. "Would you fail for lack of skill?" he asked quietly. "Or because of me?" The question was so exact it left no room for politeness. Eleanor turned fully toward him then. Candlelight caught the fine soot still smudged at his cuff from the nursery grate. "Because of both," she said. "You forbade the thing itself before you ever knew me. You took the one part of my life that did not belong to barter or duty and set your grief over it like a lock. Do you suppose that disappears because your sister-in-law has been exposed?" He went still, struck. "You are right," he said after a moment. "It does not." There was no defense in him now. No duke's cold privilege, no brittle appeal to sorrow. Only a man forced at last to look straight at the wound he had caused in someone who had done him no wrong. Eleanor had not known until that instant how much she needed him to say it plainly. He moved a little nearer, then stopped, as if he had learned that nearness was no longer his to assume. "If I ask this of you," he said, "it cannot be by command." "No." "It must be because Clara asked honestly, and because you choose honestly." "Yes." He bowed his head once. When he lifted it, his expression had steadied into something almost humble. "Then I will not order it." The silence that followed was not empty. It held the fire's low murmur, the soft shift of paper as a draft moved through the room, the far-off sound of a servant bolting a door downstairs. Eleanor looked at Clara's notes again. She could hear pieces of the sonata inwardly now with painful clarity. The chapel theme returning changed, the morning passage seeking release, that instruction to let it rise. The music wanted courage from someone. That much was plain. "I will try," she said. His breath left him, but before he could speak, she added, "On one condition." He waited. "If I am to attempt this, I must hear the instrument in the chapel before anyone else does. Alone. Except for you." For the first time since midnight, uncertainty crossed his face. Fear. Then, very quietly, he said, "Tomorrow at dawn." And in the gray hour before morning, when the chapel stones still held the night cold, he came himself to fetch her. He came for her before the first bell. The abbey was still half asleep, all gray windows and dying embers, when Eleanor stepped into the passage wrapped in a dark wool cloak. Wexford waited at the stair-foot with a lantern in one hand and the chapel key in the other. No servant followed. They crossed the terrace through a thin white mist that had settled low over the grass, and the dawn air bit cold enough to sting the throat. Gravel crunched underfoot. Somewhere beyond the yews a rook gave a single harsh cry, then all was still again. Inside the chapel the chill deepened. Stone held night longer than wood did. The place smelled of wax, damp mortar, and old prayer books. Their steps moved softly between the pews. Pale morning had only just begun to gather in the high windows, leaving the chancel in shadow. Mr. Bell had done as asked. The vestry door stood unlocked, and within, under a linen cover, waited the small, square pianoforte Clara had meant to use for rehearsal. Wexford set down the lantern and did not speak. Eleanor drew off one glove, then the other. For a moment she only stood there looking at the instrument. This, she thought, was the true edge of the matter, beyond the grand-covered pianoforte in the house, Agnes's warnings, even the copied pages spread now in her memory like a road waiting to be walked. This. Her own hand, after all these months, reaching toward keys she had been forbidden to touch. She looked once at the Duke. "If I begin," she said quietly, "I cannot pretend afterward that this was an accident." "I know." "And if you wish me to stop?" His face was pale in the lantern light, his eyes hollowed by too little sleep and too much truth. "Then I shall have to ask," he said. I will not command it." Something in her loosened at those words. Enough. She lifted the linen cover. The instrument beneath was modest, worn at the edges, the walnut dulled with age. When she opened the fallboard, a faint scent of old wood and dust rose up. One key gave a slight click as it settled back into place. Eleanor sat. The bench was colder than stone. She placed her fingertips very lightly on the keys and closed her eyes. The first notes were only Clara's chapel theme, plain and spare, the fragment she had found repeated across copies and notes, sounding softly into the stillness to test the voice of the room. The little pianoforte answered with a tender, imperfect tone, a touch dry, a touch fragile, but true. The sound went out beneath the chapel arch and came back altered, gentled by distance. Wexford made the smallest movement beside her, as if the air itself had touched him. She played the phrase again, then let it lead into the darker passage she had been hearing inwardly for nights. Still incomplete, only traced. A searching line, a grief line, a road toward return. When she stopped, the last note seemed to linger against the stone far longer than it should have. Wexford had not moved. Eleanor turned toward him, her breath shallow now from more than cold. "Do you hear it?" she asked. He did not answer at once. His hand was pressed hard against the back of the pew before him, knuckles pale, his face transformed by something raw and unguarded. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "That is her beginning," he said. "But the turn after it, that is where she meant to go when she knew she was dying." Then, before Eleanor could ask how he knew, he reached into his coat and drew out one final folded sheet. "I found this tucked behind the chapel memorial tablet at dawn," he said, "and I think it is the missing middle." Eleanor took the page from him with hands that had gone suddenly cold. The paper was thinner than the others, as if it had been folded and hidden in haste. A faint line of chapel dust marked one corner, but the notation itself was unmistakable. This was no fragment guessed at later, no copied scrap from a practice book. Clara's hand moved across the stave with urgency and control both, driving the troubled middle forward through a darker key and then lifting, not out of grief, but through it. Here was the hinge she had been missing. Here was the road between mourning and return. For a long moment Eleanor could not speak. Wexford watched her as if the fate of more than music rested in her face. The pale chapel light was growing now, turning the misted windows pearly. Somewhere beyond the chancel, a drop of water fell from stone to stone with a tiny hollow sound. The little vestry instrument sat between them like a witness. "At the memorial tablet?" she asked at last. He nodded. "Tucked behind the frame, wrapped in waxed linen." "Then she hid it herself." "I think so." The knowledge changed the shape of everything once again. Clara had hidden the page not to destroy it, not even to keep it from him forever, but to keep it from the wrong hands until the proper hour. Eleanor looked back down at the music. A faint note at the bottom, half rubbed away, became legible when she tilted it toward the light. "Wait until he can bear to hear the return." She closed her eyes once. When she opened them, she sat at the instrument and set the new page beside the copied bars. "Stand where you stood before," she said softly. "I need to hear what the room does to it." He obeyed without question. That, too, mattered. She played the opening chapel theme, then let it travel into the troubled passage, and this time, when she reached the break, she did not stop. Clara's missing middle carried her onward. The little pianoforte answered with its dry, truthful voice. Stone gathered the sound and returned it, gentled, fuller, more sorrowful than the room where it was born. Wexford had gone rigid near the pew. Eleanor did not look at him again. She followed the music. Through shadow, through ache, into the first suggestion of release. Then she reached the place where Clara's recovered page ended, and beyond that, nothing but the final instruction, the outline, the trust left to another hand. Her own hovered above the keys. She could have stopped. Perhaps she should have. But the shape was there now, luminous and terrible in her mind. The return wanted only courage and discipline. She gave it 3 bars, then 4. Then the answering line Clara had implied but not written. Completion, honest and austere. When at last she let the phrase rest unresolved and lifted her hands, the silence that followed was alive. Wexford's breath broke first. Eleanor turned then. He had one hand braced hard against the pew end, just as before, but his face had altered, opened. "Was it wrong?" she asked. He swallowed once before answering. "No." His voice was rough with wonder and pain. It was hers, and then at the end it became ours to answer. The words seemed to startle him as much as they did her. They spent the rest of that day in labor. Mr. Bell was summoned before breakfast and wept openly over the recovered page. Mrs. Finch quietly barred Agnes from the music room. Copyists were set to work. The vestry instrument was tuned a final time. The chapel was dressed for Sunday. Guests began arriving by afternoon, black carriages rolling over wet gravel, condolences gathering like crows along the edges of the estate. And when the morning of the year's mind memorial finally came, gray and breathless and full of waiting, Eleanor stood in the chapel aisle in plain mourning silk and saw that the small pianoforte had been placed in full view before the mourners. She turned toward Wexford in alarm. "I did not ask for this," she whispered. "No," he said, his gaze fixed on the instrument. "I did." When the first prayer ended, the whole chapel seemed to draw in upon itself. Black sleeves, bowed heads, damp hems darkened by the morning grass. All of Wexford's world had assembled to witness grief kept tidy. The rector's voice fell away. A hush spread under the stone arch, deep enough that Eleanor could hear the faint rattle of a window lead in the wind. The small pianoforte waited before the mourners, its polished wood catching a thin wash of gray light. Agnes rose first. "The silence," she said sharply, as if to claim it before anyone else could breathe. But Wexford turned his head toward Eleanor. He did not nod. He did not speak. He only looked at her with the face of a man standing at the edge of his own undoing and choosing not to step back. That was enough. Eleanor crossed to the instrument. She felt every gaze in the chapel follow her, the servants, the tenants, the neighboring ladies with their gloved hands clasped too tightly, Mr. Bell white-knuckled beside the choir stalls, Agnes rigid with disbelief. Eleanor sat, placed Clara's completed pages on the stand, and let her fingers rest for one heartbeat on the keys. Then she began. The opening theme moved into the chapel like a remembered prayer. Clara's voice was there in it at once, clear, disciplined, alive. The mourners stilled. The middle passage deepened, carrying sorrow honestly, neither softened nor displayed. When Eleanor reached the break where the dead hand had failed, she did not pause. She carried the line forward as it had asked to be carried, by another road and toward the light. The final return rose under the stone roof and widened there, grief answering grief, until it no longer sounded like burial. It sounded like release. At the last cadence, no one moved. Wexford had gone pale. His hand covered his mouth as though breath had left him. Agnes made a broken sound, but it was not command this time. It was loss. Real loss, at last stripped of theater. Then the Duke came down from his pew. He did not go to Clara's tablet. He came to Eleanor. In full sight of the chapel, before the servants and the rector and every watchful eye that had ever measured his house, he knelt beside the instrument and bowed his head over her ungloved hand. The touch shook through him. When he looked up, his eyes were bright with a grief finally broken open. "I have kept a coffin where a home should have stood," he said, his voice carrying farther than he seemed to know. "I asked you to live inside it with me." His fingers closed over hers, warm and unsteady. "If you can bear it, Eleanor, do not leave this place to silence again. Fill my house with sound." She answered him not with haste, but with truth. "Yes," she said, "if it may be a living house." He gave a breath that was almost a sob, almost a laugh, and rose beside her as the chapel, slowly, uncertainly, began to breathe again. By evening the mist had burned away. One upper window in the east wing stood open at last, and from somewhere within the abbey a scale was being practiced very softly, as if the walls themselves were learning. If this story stayed with you, you're welcome to leave a word below and stay near for the next one.